director de Patria de Martí, y les doy la bienvenida a el panel ¿por qué el Partido Comunista de Cuba debe ser proscrito? Imperativos históricos, jurídicos, éticos y filosóficos para establecer la democracia. La presentación va a ser bilingüe. Dos de los paneles van a ser en español, dos van a ser en inglés. Yo presentaré el tema de cada uno en el idioma que va a corresponder y haré una leve traducción a velocidad de baja para poder aprovechar el tiempo. Después de que estos paneles que los voy a presentar hagan su exposición, queremos tener un intercambio de preguntas y respuestas. Esa es la idea, dándoles a ellos otra oportunidad para profundizar sobre las posiciones que están tomando, y si sobra tiempo, pues yo daré preguntas también a ellos para aún ampliar más. Tengo que dar las gracias, por supuesto, a la Universidad Internacional de la Florida y el Instituto de Investigaciones Cubanas, muy particular a Sebastián Arcos por organizar este evento realmente tremendo. Y gracias, por supuesto, a los paneles que los voy a presentar, y gracias a Dios por así hacerlo todo posible. Voy a hacer un resumen general del panel en conjunto y después de cada ponencia, para darles a ustedes un aperitivo de lo que van a poder disfrutar con ellos. La proscripción jurídica del Partido Comunista de Cuba no es una medida revanchista, no es una anomalía antidemocrática o una exclusión ideológica arbitraria. Por el contrario, es una condición necesaria, legítima e ineludible para poder construir e institucionalizar las herramientas precisamente de la democracia. Permitir la supervivencia del Partido Comunista Cubano es entregar la democracia naciente cubana a la potencial destrucción. Se van a utilizar enfoques históricos, jurídicos comparativos, éticos normativos y filosóficos, y todo enfoque converge en la necesidad de ilegalizar el Partido Comunista de Cuba, preservando libertades básicas de expresión, de asociación. Y tenemos que entender, si todos comprendemos, cuando pensamos en Occidente, pensamos en una mesa de tres patas, o sea, Atenas, Roma y Jerusalén. Bueno, la democracia, para conceptualizarlo, es también una mesa de tres patas. Tenemos la voluntad popular, los derechos naturales y un Estado de Derecho. Si se desbalancea una de esas patas, se destruye. Un ejemplo, suponiendo que el pueblo quiere votar a favor de la esclavitud. La mayoría vota a favor de la esclavitud. Eso es democrático. Sin embargo, viola el precepto de derechos naturales y viola el precepto del Estado de Derecho regido por una Constitución. Entonces, tenemos que entender que la democracia no es un procedimiento. El procedimiento tendrá su formato, pero hay algo mucho más importante detrás de eso. Y hablando de democracia, por supuesto, estamos hablando de democracia liberal, o sea entendernos todo claro. La primera ponencia, que va a ser Francisco Rodríguez, editor, parte de la directiva de FACE, autor, comentarista e investigador. Se trata del Partido Comunista de proxy soviético a máquina totalitaria. Él va a hacer un recorrido, va a reconstruir la trayectoria histórica del PSC desde sus orígenes como organización vinculada al comunismo internacional y tras 1959 como proxy estratégica de la Unión Soviética hasta consolidarse como una máquina totalitaria autónoma. Se analiza el proceso mediante el cual el partido absorbió el Estado, monopolizó el poder político y económico, eliminó el pluralismo y se convirtió en responsable directo de graves violaciones de derechos humanos, crímenes contra la humanidad. Esta intervención establece el diagnóstico fundamental. El Partido Comunista de Cuba no ha sido un partido dentro del sistema, todo lo contrario, antisistema. Y de eso se trata. Aquí estamos tocando, con el caso cubano, la relevancia del Partido Comunista de Cuba y por qué se debe de ilegalizar, pero podemos estar hablando del partido fascista también. O sea, los partidos antisistema no deberían competir. La segunda presentación la va a hacer Jason Gianpollete. Jason es abogado internacional de derechos humanos, tiene base en Washington, D.C., aunque, si no me equivoco, es también un alma mater, igual que yo, de esta gran universidad que es la presentación de Jason, From Nuremberg to Havana, Judicial Precedent Prescribing the Communist Party of Cuba. The second presentation examines international judicial precedent for the banning of totalitarian parties, Nazi communists, and radical Islamists in established democracies and transitional contexts. From Nuremberg and the German doctrine of militant democracy, Spain, Turkey, and the Baltic states. It showed that the dissolution of organizations that advocate or embody totalitarianism is fully compatible with the rule of law and in many cases a condition for its survival. Esencialmente, Jason Gianpollete va a llevarnos a través de una transición histórica, o sea, la descripción histórica y jurídica de su aplicación utilizando diferentes modelos que todos en efecto condicionaban el éxito de la democracia a la ilegalización del partido antisistema. La tercera ponencia, lo voy a decir yo, Julio Vicente, director de Patria de Martí, autor, politólogo, y Democracia Militante o PSC eterno. La tercera ponencia desarrolla la doctrina de la democracia militante formulada por Karl Lowenstein, un jurista alemán, experto constitucionalista, que en la década de los 30 escribió una serie de escritos reflejando lo que él había visto en Alemania, en la República Weimar, el desarrollo que tuvo el Partido Nacional Socialista, y vio deficiencias en la democracia en poderse proteger de este tipo de algo que es derecho de la democracia, se estaba usando para después destruir los derechos de la democracia. Entonces, lanzó esta noción de que la democracia tiene y debe de ser militante en su defensa. La cuarta ponencia, la final, estará a cargo de Vicente Medina. Vicente es profesor de filosofía de St. Paul University, del gran estado de Nueva York, y él la va a hacer también en inglés. El título va a ser Militant Democracy, How to Prevent Dictatorship in a Future Democratic Cuba. This final presentation proposes adopting militant democracy principles to protect the future free Cuba from authoritarian relapse. This approach has worked in Italy, Spain, and Poland during the transition and is justified by Cuba's 67 years of communist rule. This presentation will review 4 historical Cuban phases from the pre-independence constitutionalism, the 1901 Constitution, the 1940 Constitution, Gerardo Machado's dictatorship, and Fidel Castro's manipulation of it to establish his regime. Again, the end goal of the panel is the same. I hope you enjoy it, and again, we look forward to a great interchange afterwards. And if there's time, then I will, ask further questions. We will make use of this time. The first panelist, Francisco Rodríguez.
Mucho gusto tenerlos a ustedes aquí. En la garita de una urbanización en Miami se presenta un automóvil, el policía lo deja entrar y las personas en el automóvil violan a la señora de una casa, matan al papá, secuestran a los hijos y le dan candela a la casa. Poco tiempo después, que aparece un camión. En Miami es usual recoger metales, la gente para ganarse su dinerito retirado, recoger metales y se aparece un camión en el cual se le parece mucho al policía, a la persona que anteriormente habían cometido este delito. Y le pregunta, ¿usted ha estado aquí antes? Y él dice, no, ese es un primo mío que se parece a mí. Pero el señor está usando un peluquín y un bigote de mentira. Y el señor le dijo, bueno, está bien, pase. En este camión, tú sabes, la gente escribe con letras, porque no es nada profesional. Y esto es lo que decía el camión. La empresa se llamaba Ladrones Comunistas, pero había tachado comunistas, y ahora se llamaba Socialista, establecido en el año 1917. Nos llevamos sus muebles y joyas gratis. Garantía totalitariamente garantizada. 100 millones de víctimas tachados clientes, satisfechos tachados muertos. Esto es lo que es el comunismo. El comunismo no es un partido a la usanza de las democracias. Es una conspiración en contra de la democracia. Y la democracia no puede ser un pacto suicida que admita cualquier cosa. En el año 57, Fidel Castro dijo en la Sierra Maestra a Herbert Matthews que no era comunista. Su revolución era más verde como las palmas. Después prometió en abril del año 59, prometió que iban a haber elecciones en 18 meses con partidos independientes. Después en el 61 de pronto dijo que él era masista y siempre había sido. Después, como veremos, por fin se declara el Partido Comunista. Luego, además de ladrones, son mentirosos. Una de las peores causas del mundo es ser mentiroso, por eso está incluido en los 10 mandamientos. Imagínate si yo tengo que ir a un hospital, el hospital queda a la izquierda, no, mejor dicho, si queda a la derecha, y un tipo me dice, no, es a la izquierda, porque a la izquierda nunca va a haber. Si me muero, porque me fui equivocado a la dirección donde me iban a ayudar. Así que ser ladrón y mentiroso, por algún motivo, los dos están entre los 10 mandamientos de la ley de Dios. Quizás el tema debe ser al revés. Creo que si vamos hacia el norte, Sweetwater o Doral, o vamos hacia el sur, o Chester o Kendall, cualquiera que te tropiece por la calle, va a decir, hombre, claro que hay que proscribir el Partido Comunista. Para nosotros es como el sol sale por la mañana y se pone por la noche. Pero para otra gente no es tan obvio. Es como decirlo, bueno, obviamente la tierra es chata, porque yo no veo que la tierra sea redonda. Hay gente que todavía anda en eso, pero el lunes yo voy a hablar con Cibercuba, una organización desde España, que tiene una encuesta del 95%, 6.516 de 6.859 encuestados, desean que haya nuevos partidos y nuevos sistemas económicos. Pues muy bien, que haya nuevos partidos. Pero Rodríguez, eso no quiere decir que hay que quitar el Partido Comunista. Están diciendo que están a favor de que haya nuevos partidos. Bueno, como hemos visto, no es tan simple la cuestión de quitarle el nombre de comunista. Porque entonces también hay que quitar el nombre de socialista, el de progresista, etcétera, etcétera. Nunca se termina la nomenclatura. Hay que ir, el cáncer es más allá del epidermis, hay que ir más profundo para evitarnos el problema de dejar pasar por la garita a delincuentes que ya nos violaron, nos asesinaron y le dieron candela a nuestra casa. En el FAYUN han oído encuestas que definitivamente concuerdan con que en Doral, en Westchester, en Kendall, en Sweetwater, la mayoría de los cubanos están en contra de la hoja y el martillo. Ahora, en el año 1954, en Estados Unidos se pasó una ley que todavía está en vigencia, que se llama el Communist Control Act. Estados Unidos, los que se opongan a la proscripción del comunismo, van a decir, oiga, porque en Estados Unidos aquí se permite el Partido Comunista. Pues sepan que no están, lo único que se permite, que esta ley no se ha puesto en vigor más fuerte, es porque es minúsculo el Partido Comunista oficial. Y entonces se puede vivir con ese partido. Pero no siempre fue así, como vamos a ver. Y el Partido Comunista, aquí y donde quiera, de un témpano de hielo, que es el tercio que se ve sobre el nivel del mar. El Partido Comunista va mucho, mucho, mucho más profundo. Si quitamos el Partido Comunista de Cuba, o mejor dicho, cuando quitemos el Partido Comunista de Cuba, ellos se van a defender como gato boca arriba, porque esa gente, si tienen algo, es la persistencia. Pero sabemos que hay gatos encerrados en todo esto de los comunistas. Y sabemos que el problema es quién le pone el cascabel al gato. Y por fin será Donald Trump. En estos 2 días, los días y medio en que he estado aquí, he oído varias ponencias y me llamó la atención que no se decía comunismo, se hablaba del sistema. Pero es que el sistema tiene apellido, es el sistema comunista. Entonces, qué raro que estamos en Miami y parece que hay una reticencia a hablar claramente. Estamos en una universidad. Luego entonces yo creo que esto de analizar si debemos de permitir el Partido Comunista o no, se entiende precisamente porque estamos en un ámbito académico, pero en la calle no hay duda ninguna. Porque nos quemaron la casa, nos violaron a la esposa, nos llevaron a nuestros hijos. Yo no estoy en contra del Partido Comunista. Creo que el Partido Comunista de Cuba en Ciudad México sería ideal, en el exilio. Es más, les propongo al lado de la calle Londres 247, Colonia del Carmen, Coyoacán, Ciudad México. Esa es la casa azul, es la casa de Frida Kahlo. Y usted entra ahí, todo ocio y martillo, por donde quiera. Pues al lado hay una casa roja, salgan de la embajada, trasládense ahí, ahora tendrán que comer tacos en vez de comer bistec. Pero yo encantado que sean parte. Ahora, muchos partidos pueden haber. En la última sesión de Patria Martín hablé. Yo trabajo para FACE, Facts About Cuban Exiles. Tenemos este libro. Como verán, Cuba se mueve siempre entre el águila de Estados Unidos y el león de Castilla. Son 2 elementos fundamentales que no nos podemos escapar. Somos españoles en América y somos espabilados para vender cosas y comprar en Estados Unidos. Y desgraciadamente vivir en Estados Unidos últimamente. Entonces, que en Cuba haya un partido que quiera hacer la autonomía 18 de España, se puede permitir. Que en Cuba hayan anexionistas que quieren que Cuba sea el Estado 51 y que ganemos a Canadá o a Groenlandia. Permitido también. Ahora, permitir la gente que nos quemaron la casa. Inconcebible. Ahora voy a entrar ya en materia. El primer pilar de esta ponencia es que el PSC hasta nuestros días siempre ha estado subordinado a intereses extranjeros. Primero de la URSS durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial y desde la Guerra Fría, comenzando con la Conferencia Intercontinental de La Habana en 1966, a los intereses de China, Rusia, dictadores criminales como Ho Chi Minh, Pol Pot, Mao Zedong, las dinastías Kim y Ortega, Chávez, Maduro y extremistas islámicos patrocinados por los ayatolás. Ya ha cumplido un siglo, el PSC estuvo vinculado primero a la URSS y hoy al Foro de Sao Paulo, y tras la caída del muro de Berlín se ha consolidado como una máquina totalitaria autónoma luego de absorber el Estado, monopolizando el poder político y económico, eliminando el pluralismo y convirtiéndose en responsable directo de graves violaciones de derechos humanos y crímenes de lesa humanidad. El segundo pilar de esta ponencia es que el PSC no ha sido un partido, como se conoce en democracia, sino que clandestinamente tomó el control del Estado a base de una conspiración internacional. El PSC constituye uno de los ejemplos más claros de transformación de un movimiento revolucionario en estructura de poder totalitario. Esta evolución estuvo profundamente condicionada por la inserción del partido en el entramado del comunismo internacional. Desde sus orígenes mantuvo vínculos estrechos con la Internacional Comunista y tras 1959 la relación con la Unión Soviética se intensificó hasta convertir al PSC en un verdadero proxy de los intereses geopolíticos de Moscú en las Américas, Asia y África. Cuba se transformó en plataforma para la exportación del terrorismo a Estados Unidos, Argentina y Uruguay, e insurgencias armadas en Venezuela, Colombia, Bolivia, Nicaragua y El Salvador, el despliegue de tropas en África, no solo en Angola y Etiopía, bajo dirección estratégica soviética, sino además de injerencia política en todos los países donde mantienen baja. A cambio, el régimen recibió subsidios masivos que sostuvieron su economía y reforzaron su dependencia estructural en la URSS. Con la institucionalización del sistema de la década de 1970, el PSC completó su conversión en una auténtica máquina totalitaria. La Constitución de 1976, así como sus reformas posteriores del 92 y 2019, consagró al partido como la fuerza dirigente superior de la sociedad y del Estado. Artículo 5. Esta disposición eliminó cualquier separación real entre partido, gobierno, fuerzas armadas y aparatos de seguridad, instaurando un control monolítico sobre la vida política, social y cultural del país. Las estructuras partidistas se superponen a las estatales, garantizando la ausencia del pluralismo, alternancia o rendición de cuentas. El historial del PSC está marcado además por graves violaciones de derechos humanos. Desde los primeros años del régimen, el partido impulsó una represión sistemática contra opositores políticos, disidentes, religiosos y toda forma de pensamiento independiente. Ejecuciones sumarias, encarcelamientos prolongados, vigilancia masiva y campos de trabajo forzados como la OMAN en los años 60 forman parte de este legado ampliamente documentado por organizaciones internacionales de derechos humanos. A ello se suma la confiscación masiva de propiedades privadas sin compensación, así como prácticas contemporáneas denunciadas como trabajo forzado vinculado a las llamadas misiones internacionalistas. En conjunto, la trayectoria del PSC revela el tránsito de un instrumento subordinado a intereses externos a una estructura autónoma de dominación totalitaria, cuya permanencia en el poder ha requerido la negación sistemática de las libertades fundamentales del pueblo cubano. 1 de enero de 1959, el día más feliz de mi vida. Yo tenía 10 años de edad. Me encontraba sentado en el piso de la sala de mi casa en La Habana mirando un noticiero en televisión en blanco y negro sobre el contundente acontecimiento que significaba la partida furtiva de Cuba de Fulgencio Batista. Digo que era en ese momento el día más feliz de mi corta vida, pues en mi casa todos estábamos a favor de la insurgencia contra Batista y yo nunca me había imaginado que existieran tantas banderas cubanas como las que ahora humeaban desde los balcones de la ciudad. Pues bien, entró en la sala mi madre, quien expresó: "Oh, todos nos miramos hacia ella para saber por qué ella se había expresado así. Ella añadió, hay un comunista en la televisión. Mi padre, quien había sido comunista en su juventud durante el machadato, respondió, en democracia todos los partidos pueden participar. Mi madre, no convencida, le contestó, no me gusta esto. Mi madre, farmacéutica graduada de la Universidad de La Habana, sabía perfectamente el agua que traía la nube comunista. Desde el año 1925, los comunistas habían estado activos en la vida pública de Cuba, y aunque ella desconocía todos los vericuetos de la conspiración en los 2/3 del templo de hielo bajo el agua, sabía que nada bueno le departía esto al pueblo de Cuba, y mucho menos a ella y a su familia. Este sufrimiento individual, familiar, nacional, no se puede dejar a un lado mediante cualquier frío planteamiento académico. Y este sufrimiento es el tercer pilar que fundamenta la prohibición de este partido para que nunca jamás se asome al poder. Como a un delincuente se le prohíbe acercarse a su víctima. Luego entonces, yo he estado considerando el tema de que si en Cuba se debe o no permitir el Partido Comunista desde hace más de 67 años de sufrimiento cubano. No sería hasta el 22 de diciembre del 61 que Fidel Castro se sacaría la máscara declarando, desde luego, si nosotros nos paramos en el Pico Turquino cuando éramos 4 gatos y decimos somos marxistas-leninistas, desde el Pico Turquino posiblemente nos hubieran podido bajar allá. No hubiéramos podido bajar allá. Así que nosotros nos denominamos de otra manera. No abordamos este tema. El Partido Comunista de Cuba fue fundado en el clandestinaje, pero esto no es nada nuevo, que no sea legal el Partido Comunista, por Julio Antonio Mella en 1925. En la década de los 30 adoptó el nombre Unión Revolucionaria Comunista y en el 44 pasó a denominarse Partido Socialista Popular por orden de Stalin. Evidencia directa de que era controlado por control remoto por la URSS. En el año 44, Batista sale presidente democráticamente apoyado por la coalición socialista democrática. El mismo nombre que se usa hoy con el alcalde de Nueva York. No hay nada nuevo, bajo el sol. Sí, tengo más, pero si quieres me detengo aquí y seguimos más adelante para darle oportunidad democrática.
First, I want to thank FIU, Julio, all of you for having us over. It's been a privilege chatting with you all here today about this topic, one that I've followed for a very long time. We're going to, I'm going to give you a Cliff Note version of this due to time. So we're going to publish our findings. We're going to survey, goes back to Nuremberg. And once the conference is over, you'll be able to download it. What I want to do with you here this morning, though, is go through some themes that come from all these cases, and hopefully set you up with a framework that can be used in the case of Cuba. So before we dive into Cuba's future, let's reckon a little bit with the past, especially as it relates to justice and accountability. What does that mean? For example, at the end of World War II, nation-states had contacts with their adversaries. So we did have tribunals at Nuremberg to hold those to account, deemed as architects or implementers of the Holocaust and the World War II atrocities before the end of the war. But Allied powers during that time were reaching out to the Nazis to ascertain steps of surrender, post-war, and beyond. Nuremberg was not a mystery to the future Nazis, and in fact it was used as leverage before the end of the war. Nuremberg tribunals were followed by individual trials elsewhere. The Nazis were broadly shunned from civil society, but the party itself was not put on trial directly at Nuremberg. There's a lot of reasons for that. We can talk about it during the questions and answers. So even as Americans were directly involved in the liberation of concentration camps in European nations, American jurists spearheaded accountability efforts at Nuremberg. The U.S. had contact with the Reich and other officials, such as scientists, and I'll get back to that in a minute why this is important. These contacts were critical to U.S. interests during the post-World War II period, such as our space program, missile, and nuclear program to defend, deter, and counter Soviet Union communist bloc aggression during the Cold War. Just as past national decisions shaped our space program and some accountability was secondary, so will our choices shape Cuba's future, but with significant guardrails that we'll talk about in 1 second. Will the Cuban people allow the Cuban Communist Party a seat at a table in a new Cuba after decades of repression? I don't believe they should. That's a question up to the Cuban people. As Cubans stand up to this new launch pad, let's ensure that what we build is freedom without shadows of the past. The first time I saw an American president in person was right here in Miami in 1983. Ronald Reagan was visiting for a lunch and a rally. I was 13 years old back then. I'm 56 now. 43 years later, that debate that centered on the same questions that Reagan was talking about are still relevant today. Cold War realities such as the Soviets may no longer exist, but the red thread of communism still does at a global level, and Cuba is right in the middle of it. So the future of the Communist Party in Cuba is going to be very critical to the reset that Reagan was talking about back in 1983. You can read that in what Reagan was talking about because he talked about that issue. See, at the heart of what this panel and others at the conference I've been listening to have been talking about is bigger than the Communist Party of Cuba, or whether or not we should ban it, exclude it, or otherwise prohibit Cuba Communist Party from political life. It's about the kind of Cuba Cubans want to build moving forward, rather than respect for the individual, private property, and the rule of law. For years I have said the political future belongs to the Cuban people. And in my view, this question should be decided in Cuba as a first principle. They have earned that right to make it so without outsiders telling them what to do. In my opinion, there should not be a UN tribunal. There should not be an OAS tribunal. In fact, I would dare say there shouldn't even be foreign lawyers trying to guide that process. I've had the honor of working with many Cuban lawyers the past 10 years, and there are many eager to do it inside the island. And I think we all have a chance at doing that. A country that has lived under one-party system for decades will eventually confront some very hard questions about political participation, accountability, and legitimacy. Those answers cannot be imposed by outsiders. And in many same way that Reagan talked about what is the next best hope for the Western Hemisphere, I believe starts and ends with this discussion as it relates to the communist global system. As an American lawyer, the idea of banning a political party triggers a lot of skepticism. The American political system is built on the premise that ideas, even dangerous ideas, are defeated through debate, law, elections, not prohibition. We protect speech, we protect association, we distrust ideological exclusion. Yet this journey was unique to us, and every nation's past in tackling these tough issues belongs to those nations. We had a civil war followed by Reconstruction. We tackled it then. Yet our nation has not banned political parties, as is happening in parts of Europe today, or banished them as was done centuries ago. Again, it's unique to the American system. But when you examine the recent historical record, a lot of what you can view in the survey that we prepared, you find that some democracies have banned political parties under very tight, specific circumstances after significant periods of trauma, such as the former Eastern Bloc countries, the post-Franco tolerance laws during the terrorism crackdown in Spain, the Haiti Batasuna cases. And in some cases, nation states have blocked nation states with the international system, which I find peculiar to Cuba that it hasn't happened. Acting through the UN system, the UN members treated Franco Spain as an outlier after World War II. Spain was excluded from UN membership in the post-war period. It only happened in 1955 that they were welcomed in because there was political utility of doing so to defeat the communists. Post-war Germany has developed the doctrine of defense of democracy. It allows courts to prohibit parties that sought to abolish constitutional order itself. Post-Soviet states have imposed restrictions on former ruling parties during fragile democratic transition. Spain dissolved political formations linked to terrorism in recent history, not because of ideology alone, but because of demonstrable operational ties to violence, linked in history and linked to actual activity today. And even in the European human rights system, the European courts have accepted that in exceptional cases we can, through democratic self-defense, justify exclusion of a group of people, provided it is evidence-based, judicially supervised, and proportionate. Across these cases we reviewed, with a Cuban lawyer, we did all this work with a former Cuban lawyer and judge. One principle emerges: prescription is not justified by belief alone, but by due process, institutional function, or by a law designed for that purpose in a free society. You have to ban a party clearly under rules that are set forth in a free society. But there's some things you can do beforehand, which I'll talk about in a second, but I think to help that process along. Decisions who can participate in public life are at the core politically grave and moral decisions. Questions of constitutional self-preservation and civic legitimacy. Today it's the communist, tomorrow who knows. The moral danger and moral hazard of political exclusion is ancient. Scripture is blunt about what it means to be cast out. Genesis gives us the first example of an expulsion, and in Daniel 4 we show how a ruler was driven from power until he recognizes there is a law above his own will. But there are stories and there are many more. The focus has to be always bound in law. You don't want to fall back and provide the conditions for a process that is similar to what was done in Cuba in 1959. And I agree with my colleague, the Communist Party has roots that plotting to undermine the Cuban Republic is way before that. So we have a rich history. It's how we get there. When a society tries to settle political accounts without law, it cannot get accountability. It gets score setting. And in worst cases, the country fractures. Look at places like Colombia, where unresolved grievances and weak institutions help feed an insurgency and decades of internal conflict. In Nicaragua, which I think is a better example, the Sandinistas escaped true accountability and justice. They, quote, elected their way back into power, and look at what is happening in Nicaragua today. One of the lessons that exclusion, if it is to be legitimate, must be evidence-based and tightly cabinet. The time to talk about this is now, not when there's a leadership crisis in Cuba. And Americans can play and have been playing an important role in that process. When a political organization uses the machinery of state to eliminate rivals and impose a mandatory ideological framework on the people, then put them in a box that competes with the ballot box, we're inflicting profound injuries on natural law and fundamental rights. This raises a difficult sequencing question that responsible nations, starting with the U.S., must start working on now. America has thought through this quite a bit. In the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, or the Libertad Act, or called Helms-Burton, we have guardrails, a lot of guardrails, that talk about the Communist Party's role in the future Cuba. Under U.S. law, for example, the U.S. government is supposed to deny visas to Cuban nationals who are officers or employees of the Cuban government or the Communist Party. But we're not doing that. We are supposed to not do business with system-controlled companies or those trafficking in property stolen from Americans and Cubans. So why are we not enforcing those laws? Because by every law we do not enforce, we are sending a signal to people in Cuba that we don't take this seriously. And that's laying a predicate for what we can or cannot do in the Cuba of tomorrow when it comes to removing certain people from civic life. Why have we not indicted Raul Castro and others who have killed Americans? The American people do not want our homeland turned into a haven for Cuban communists, war criminals, or genocidaires. One of the reasons the U.S. maintains dedicated capacity in this space is to ensure America does not become a haven for human rights abuse. In the Department of Homeland Security, there is a whole unit dedicated to exposing and expelling human rights violators, including on the War Crime Center. These people are experts at identifying, investigating, and pursuing those who have committed grave violations of human rights, who have later sought to do refuge here. Engagement or recognition without accountability or tangible, verifiable contrition or course correction can function to politically and historically act as a kind of absolution. And that is where the legal and moral tension lies. In the Cuban context, U.S. law operates as a light guardrail. Guardrails we did not have in Nuremberg. It reflects Congress's judgment, meaning the American people's judgment, that normalization should not amount to quiet waiver of responsibility for gross violation of human rights, property confiscation, or teaming with our adversaries and other abuses in the inter-American system. I'm going to wrap up, and I'm running out of time, but I will talk about this in the Q&A. We have to keep in mind that the Cuban Communist Party is still committed to the system, a communist system that hasn't changed. To my knowledge, not one single official Communist Party has ever openly discussed contrition, much less changing their ways. In my opinion, they have forfeited their right as a matter of international law and Cuban law. I spoke to many Cuban lawyers about this. There's a legal pathway in Cuba to do this. And certain people should not be allowed to participate in Cuban civil society. Now, the U.S. needs to make a better take of the laws that we have. Societies emerging from totalitarian rule, which is happening today, has these twin temptations that we saw in German cases and the Eastern Bloc cases. You normalize too quickly, you erase memory. Or you exclude too broadly, you will undermine pluralism. The challenge is to do neither. The Cuban case, as all cases we have reviewed, meet. The solution should not be imported from Germany, Spain, or Eastern Europe. They need to come from Cuban society, from the Cuban experience, with open debate, even with people we do not like, institutional development, and constitutional design. Accountability will precede legitimacy. Accountability begins with record building, documentation, victim testimony, archival preservation, building cases, something very painstaking that's already underway that we have to do a lot more of. I wrap up, I have a minute. Just skip over a few things. Long. A Cuban doctor once shared with me what this process needs to look like. And he compared it to political bereavement. It's when you are helping someone who's suffering a severe burn. And you know that process can be very painful. But he compared it to exactly that process. It means that we must confront the corruption, dismantle the compromised structures, remove layers and layers of decay that have piled up for centuries, even decades. And it's going to hurt, and will provoke resistance. But without it, you will leave an infection that cannot be removed without this type of sunshine. Mercy without truth becomes sentimentality. Amnesty without justice becomes complicity. A free Cuba cannot be built on denial. It must be built on clarity about what happened, who was harmed, and what cannot be committed again. The Communist Party, through words and deeds, have forfeited the right to participate in that process. We are seeing a lot of this accountability starting in U.S. courts, but we need to ramp up our efforts, pool our resources, and make sure that this never happens again 90 miles from U.S. shores, and that we don't become a haven for these people ever again.
Y creo que es un buen momento para resaltar esto. Cuando hablamos de legalizar el Partido Comunista de Cuba, el Partido Antisistema, es parte de todo un proceso de descomunización, que incluye justicia transicional, ilustración y otros mecanismos. Hoy estamos tratando esto. En el libro que estoy trabajando sí está todo, Sí. Gracias por contar. Bueno, mi ponencia, democracia militante o PTC eterno. La pregunta central es cómo puede Cuba evitar el suicidio democrático durante la transición. Recordemos siempre, liberación es una cosa, se cae un régimen, todo el mundo celebra, pero el camino hacia la democracia, la transición, si se llega o no, depende de la ruta que se tome y lo que se haga. Esto es parte de ese procedimiento. El Partido Comunista de Cuba no puede ser tratado e entendido como un partido tradicional, como miramos, por ejemplo, en el Mundo Libre, que es un partido político. La frase clave establecida por Carl Lowenstein en 1937 en un ensayo brillante en el American Political Science Review: la democracia debe volverse militante. De ahí es donde sale. Esta ponencia va a tratar de explicar un poco esta doctrina, aplicarla a Cuba, revisar precedentes y abordar críticas, porque sin lugar a dudas hay críticas varias acerca de que si es una medida autoritaria. académico Lowenstein observó, como dije anteriormente, que en la Europa de la posguerra había una vulnerabilidad, lo que él vio en la República Weimar de Alemania, donde el partido nazi logró democráticamente llegar al poder y democráticamente logró ir desmantelando las instituciones. Esto, podemos decir, lo hemos visto en Venezuela, lo hemos visto en Nicaragua, o sea que este modelo se perfeccionó con el tiempo, porque dentro de la legalidad de una dictadura, legal no quiere decir moral ni ético. Entonces, siempre tenemos que entender que las dictaduras tienen su legalidad y pretenden que el castrismo ha hecho toda una industria de eso. El principio central es que el pluralismo presupone un consenso mínimo de las reglas del juego democrático. O sea, la democracia tiene ciertas reglas y quien va a participar en esas reglas, o sea, quien va a participar en el sistema, perdón, tiene que aceptar esas reglas. Lo que la regla no les gusta, o sea, lo que la regla dice, ok, tú puedes participar, pero tú no puedes cambiar el sistema. Pero el decir no, voy a participar y después voy a cambiar el sistema, es ahí el grave peligro. En otras palabras, tiene que haber una supremacía constitucional sobre la voluntad partidista y me atrevo a decir hasta la voluntad popular, porque de nuevo, si todas las personas, si la mayoría de la ciudadanía está a favor de determinado partido, entendiendo lo que ese partido va a hacer, ya ahí viola el precepto de los derechos naturales, viola la Constitución propiamente. Por eso es que vemos la corrida para cambiar la legalidad, cambiar la Constitución, para decir, no, esto se está haciendo constitucionalmente. Tanto que la democracia tiene el derecho como el deber de defenderse institucionalmente. Vamos al caso cubano. Como se ha comentado, la realidad del Partido Comunista de Cuba está estructuralmente constituido como una maquinaria que lo define fuera de la norma de lo que es un partido político tradicional. La Constitución de 1936, que fue reformada en el 2019, el artículo 5. El Partido Comunista es la fuerza dirigente superior de la sociedad y el Estado. ¿Pero quién lo dice? ¿De dónde viene eso? Lo dicen ellos. Bueno, eso no es democrático, eso no es plural. O sea, yo me atrevo a decir que la mayoría de los cubanos dicen que no representa el Partido Comunista, pero eso es parte de la maquinaria, la verdad, de que somos una democracia diferente, somos una democracia propia, de que somos una democracia, o sea, vender como un caso subgénero cuando es simplemente una dictadura burda y cruel y más nada. Esta cosa no hay que, dictaduras comunistas, igual que las dictaduras fascistas, buscan justificar insultando la inteligencia. Bueno, su ciudadano no tiene alternativa, pero el terrorismo de Estado promueve la idea. Pero en el exterior sí quieren validar el despotismo buscando estas herramientas que dicen que son una... Putin dice que Rusia es una democracia guiada. No existe separación de poder del partido al resto de las instituciones. Las violaciones sistemáticas y crímenes de lesa humanidad, violaciones de derechos humanos cometidas en el nombre por el Partido Comunista, es evidente, no hay que entrar en eso, la confiscación, el saqueo masivo de propiedades, que en el caso de los estadounidenses fue el mayor robo en la historia, la subordinación que también se ha establecido aquí a potencias extranjeras. En fin, el Partido Comunista no es un competidor más, sino es un instrumento, y esta parte es muy importante, que absorbe el Estado. Los partidos no están supuestos a eso. Un partido político es una voz que refleja una visión, que a lo mejor puede reflejar la voz mayoritaria, pero no puede absorber el Estado supuestamente es de todos, ¿verdad? Entonces, ya esa absorción, ese absorberlo, y le unes el concepto leninista del centralismo democrático, que quiere decir que, bueno, que hay una visión y se acabó. O sea, no es que todos los que están en el Partido Comunista sean descerebrados y piensan igual, no, es que no tienen alternativa. Públicamente no pueden salirse del cerco que estableció Lenin, y van así como títeres yéndose adelante. El poder hegemónico que adquiere un partido totalitario como el Partido Comunista de Cuba le asegura que muchos después que están en el poder van a seguir con acceso privilegiado si fueran a competir en elecciones democráticas. Porque recordemos que esas instituciones y su capacitación hegemónica sobre la base económica del país, la base cultural, la base mediática, le asegura una preferencia en cualquier contienda popular, de modo de que hay que aniquilarla. Los precedentes comparativos, la República Federal de Alemania, a partir de 1949, la Ley Fundamental, artículo 21, en 1952 el Partido del Reich Socialista, prohibido, 1956 el Partido Comunista de Alemania, prohibido. Esto es una protección que lo hemos visto en Europa del Este, en algunos países, Rumanía, Lituania, Letonia. Estas rupturas con ese pasado permitieron energizar el sistema multipartidista. ¿Cuáles son algunas de las críticas? Y críticas válidas. Bueno, que esto es un riesgo de abuso de poder, que es un terreno resbaladizo para llegar al autoritarismo, que es la potencial para eliminar sectores. Pero la realidad es que la libertad de expresión, nadie está diciendo que un comunista no puede tener una manifestación, que no puede protestar, que no se puede reunir. Eso es garantizado. No pueden hacer competir en las elecciones. Y dicho sea de paso, los Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, sí están legales, pero cuando lo ven en la boleta, muy poco. ¿Por qué? Porque los estados tienen determinadas restricciones en cuanto a, en este caso ya un aspecto técnico, el electoral, para poder aparecer en las boletas. El control judicial, o sea, por tribunales constitucionales independientes, determinaría qué partido pudiera o no, de modo de que esto está sujeto a una revisión judicial acerca de los partidos que pudieran o no partir. De nuevo, no estamos hablando solo del Partido Comunista, un partido fascista, un partido que decida promover la esclavitud, por ejemplo, de nuevo, repetir, o que se le pueden golpear a personas que tengan ganas, que sea legal, porque esa es la plataforma de ese partido, no puede participar, porque ya viola uno de esos preceptos de la Constitución, de igualdad y derechos naturales. Entonces, este balance, una corte independiente determinaría quién puede y quién no puede. Se me fue, ¿no? Paciencia, porque es por no indultar. Por eso es que me dijo que el problema de presentaciones, aquí ya lo retomo. Ya lo van a mirar. ¿Qué hacemos porque hay que tomar en cuenta el factor de la proporcionalidad, con personas que sientan un apego emocional, que es una cosa válida por partidos de izquierda? Hay una izquierda democrática que tiene derecho a participar. De hecho, Cuba republicana tenía una izquierda democrática. O sea, la socialdemocracia, los partidos, tanto el ortodoxo como el auténtico, eran partidos socialdemocráticos y abrazaban la democracia. La Constitución de 1940, un proceso democrático, es demasiado democrático con la tolerancia del Partido Comunista, pero bueno, quiero decir que si hay una izquierda democrática, y perfectamente si alguien sintió un apego emocional por el comunismo, si verdaderamente está decidido a aceptar las reglas del juego democrático, existe el Partido Socialdemócrata que no acepta, es magnífico. O sea, eso, nadie está diciendo que no puede ser, y repito, nadie está diciendo que no se pueden tener marxistas crudos y rudos, tener su derecho a expresión y asociación. Perfecto. Pero estas medidas militantes condicionan un impacto mínimo de autodefensa democrática. Una futura constitución cubana, sea la 1940 enmendada, lo que fuera, tiene que tomar eso en cuenta de nuevo como parte de todo un mecanismo de descomunización en Cuba para precisamente darle una viabilidad a la democracia en Cuba. Solo un compromiso resuelto con la democracia que se reserve a sí mismo es lo que hará que logren profundizar esas raíces democráticas y esas instituciones necesarias preservar, durar. Para concluir, esto no es censura, esto no es revancha, existirán mecanismos independientes que determinen. Nadie va a ser silenciado, la libre expresión es garantizada, pero la democracia tiene reglas que hay que aceptarlas o si no, no se puede participar. La democracia es muy vulnerable y de no ser así, corre riesgo de extinción, particularmente viniendo de un régimen totalitario de casi 7 décadas en el poder. Muchísimas gracias. Ahora viene nuestro último panelista, Vicente Medina. Y después vamos a preguntas, respuestas.
I want to start with the concept of militant democracy, so to define it. Do you hear me? Okay. Just define it, and then because there's a lot of issues about militant democracy in terms of prejudice, I think that's fully pointed out before. By militant democracy, I understand a representative multi-party system whose members are pre-committed, and this is the key, pre-committed to preserving the existence and integrity of an equal right to compete for political power based on the notion of majority rule. So a democracy is militant only if it does not allow its enemies. I know we can focus on the notion of enemies, namely because we advocate suspending or abolishing such an equal right to compete for political power. Those are the enemies. Some folks claim that that's a bit fuzzy, that's not clear, but it seems to me that the enemies of democracy could be clearly specified and the concept could be operationalized in a way that it would not be considered to be exclusionary on arbitrary grounds. But anyway, this is a long story that I'm going to try to compress. One of the things is the notion of militant democracy is relatively new because it emerged during World War II. But the notion itself, if you think about it, is a very old notion because it's the old notion against how to prevent tyranny. And this being sort of the underscoring point in political philosophy, the history of political philosophy, and political theory as such. So how to prevent tyranny, and then militant democracy is the latest theory that we have on how to prevent tyranny. Back in the 16th century, we have constitutionalism on the one hand, where you have the division of power to try to actually check the power of government in that sense, and then you have liberalism on the other hand, where you have the defense of certain fundamental rights. Combine both, then we come up with the notion of the rule of law, but the rule of law was not sufficient during World War II to prevent those authoritarian parties to actually come to power. So that's the emergence of militant democracy. So again, the concept of against tyranny, we do have a history in in the history of Cuba constitutionalism. We can go back to 1820, and then Félix Varela is the first one who actually advocates against the national theory by espousing and writing a commentary on the Constitution of Cadiz of 1812. And so he has been and still is an inspiration, and I hope he will be in the future democratic Cuba, to think about it when we decide if we do so, draft a new constitution and establish a new constitutional order. Now, going quickly, the constitutionalism during the War of Independence, there were many constitutions that were actually enacted. The Guaymalló Constitution of 1869, at the beginning of the War of Independence, actually does not talk about the notion of a republican government as such. And even though it recognizes certain rights, but no, it doesn't mention the notion of republican government. The Constitution of Ibargüengout in 1895, and unlike the Guaymalló Constitution, it is preamble unambiguously states that Cuba's independence from Spain will result in a democratic republic. First commitment to the democratic republic. Constitution of La Yaya in 1897 again reaffirms the same democratic republic. But now, coming all the way to modern constitutionalism in Cuba, which emerged with the Constitution of 1901, that was basically imposed to some extent, and it was influenced by the American Constitution. And now, it allows the 1901 Constitution, like the United States Constitution, allow for what we call a strong presidential system. And we have Article 40 in that Constitution that granted the power to the President to suspend the right of due process, writ habeas corpus, although temporarily, during an invasion of the national territory or when there was great perturbance that threatened domestic peace. The Article 40, to the best of my knowledge, others illustrious here panelists who might correct on this, was never appealed to by any Cuban president after 1901. The reason being that they have, I'm going to comment now, the Platt Amendment, where that's when they appealed to actually bring the foreign intervention of the United States at the time. So while the 1901 Constitution was a modern constitutional text, embedded with similar values of the United States Constitution, it was born with a question of addendum on the Platt Amendment, guarantees that the United States government has the right to intervene in Cuba's affairs as a condition for adopting the newly approved Constitution. That was a really great debate, and back then, I think it was approved only by one vote or so. That had casted a shadow, a dark shadow, on Cuban constitutionalism that different political authors in Cuban history have used it to actually subvert the constitutional order. By allowing the strong executive branch and thereby what is known as presidential democracy, the 1901 constitutional text helped to establish a weak constitutional democracy vulnerable to the autocratic exploits of the president. But the first substantive challenge to the constitutional order was actually with President Gerardo Machado in 1928. He reformed the 1901 Constitution to perpetuate himself in power by extending the presidential term from 4 to 6 years and not allowing the 1930 election as prescribed by the 1901 Constitution. By trying to perpetuate himself in power with the infamous prorogation of powers, proroga de poderes, he acted as a dictator, and clearly so. Nevertheless, President Machado's political candidate failed because most of Cubans, or the constituting power, Pouvoir Constituant, united against the Pouvoir Constituent, which is the constituted power of the government, and President Machado was finally forced to resign in 1933. Now comes the real interesting constitutional order designed by the 1940 Constitution. The new Magna Carta tried to improve over the 1901 by offering, again, it refers to Article 40, right, as a constitutional defense against future challenges to Cuba's constitutional democracy. There is a degree of, there is a sense in which this Article 40 could be viewed as a defense of militant democracy. But it's rather, it is rather ambiguous. So Article 40 states the following: provisions of legal, governmental, or any other nature that regulates the exercise of the rights guaranteed by this Constitution shall be null if they abridge, restrict, or corrupt said rights, the legal rights already embedded in the constitutional order and the constitutional text. Adequate resistance, and here's where it comes in, the ambiguity. Adequate resistance for the protection of individual rights previously guaranteed is legitimate. So, adequate resistance to any kind of abuse of power or tyrannical government was actually justified under the 1940 Constitution. However, the new Constitution is rather opaque about who decides if and when the rights stated in the constitutional text have been violated. That's not clear at all. And I think the fact that they leave that opening, you can see now how different folks manipulated this constitutional text. On March 10th, 1952, 3 months before a new presidential election were to be held, former instrument of Cuba and politics and legally elected president in 1944, Fulgencio Batista, deposed the constitutional elected president Carlos Príos Alcaraz in a coup and suspected he became Cuba's new dictator. So we had Machado before, now we have Batista, the second one. It is ironic that after being captured during the failed attack to the Moncada barrack in Santiago de Cuba on July 1926, 1953, to try to overthrow the illegitimate government of Batista's dictatorship, Fidel Castro offered, among other reasons in his defense, an appeal to Article 40, adequate resistance to the dictatorship at the time. Paradoxically, once Castro and his July 26 movement succeeded overthrowing Batista's dictatorship in January 1959, he and his cohorts moved to suspend the 1940 Constitution, despite his promise and public commitment to re-establish and honor it in his 1953 speech, in Circulazione Elettronica Soberana. And by the way, this same appeal to adequate resistance were used by George Manuel Urrutia in his defense of some members of the July movement too. Fidel Castro became the supreme leader of a newly created sovereign dictatorship, and we can get into that if you want, the notion of sovereign dictatorship and of the commissary dictatorship, who started governing essentially by executive orders until 1976, when a new constitution inspired by the constitutional text of the former Soviet Union, based on the Marxist-Leninist principle, was enacted. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, Cuba's leadership decided that it was time to amend the 1976 Marxist-Leninist Constitution. There were reasons for that, mostly economic reasons. As a result, in 1992, they drafted a new Magna Carta. This new constitutional text, in principle, allowed for foreign investment and the possession of private property, religious freedom, the right to habeas corpus, and most importantly, Article 88. The latter article allows citizens to submit proposals for legal changes to be discussed by members of the National Assembly of People's Powers, provided that at least 10,000 citizens who are eligible to vote make the proposal. So, people, Cuban citizens were able to initiate this kind of move, which that's where the Varela Project emerged. And now and that's when Osvaldo Payá, the late Osvaldo Payá, and the Movimiento de Liberación Cristiano collectively presented sufficient signatures to disclose a proposal to reform the 1992 Magna Carta. After the government refused to accept the legally collected signatures of the Varela project, at the behest of Cuba's President Fidel Castro, a campaign of harassment and intimidation occurred against leaders and supporters of the project. In June 2002, the National Assembly of People's Power voted overwhelmingly to amend Article 137 of Cuba 1992 Magna Carta to make socialism irrevocable. In February 2019, government officials modified the 1992 Magna Carta, preserving the irrevocability of socialism as such. This was really ironic because Castro was supporting back then Manuel Zelaya plebiscite that was illegal under the Honduran Constitution, and Castro was opposed to that. So at the same time that he was actually supporting this Zelaya's initiative, he was opposing in Cuba's Varela project. And by the way, Varela project, I think there is a misconception there. It is not clear under the Constitution that they could actually try to change the constitutional order at the time. They could only propose, but the People's Power were the one who actually decided whether or not they wanted to move on into that. I think Payá and his competitors had really great expectations that they were going to move it forward, but what they did is they decided not to even talk about it, which is a joke. No, that's fine. I'll go directly to the end. Let me go directly to the end because it's very good. Let me see. Now that the rest, Carl Augustine offered the notion of political democracy, I think Julio pointed out. Prior to that, the first defense let me highlight this because this I think is really ironic. The first defense of constitutional democracy, it was not presented by Karl Lowenstein, it was presented by Carl Schmitt in the Gallery of Legitimacy in 1932. And Carl Schmitt is really a pariah. You know, he's called the crown jurist of the Third Reich. He published a little book in 1932 where he clearly says, you know, we cannot allow the Bolsheviks and the Nazis to go to compete for political power because they do not recognize a fundamental right, a fundamental equal right to compete for political power. So that cannot be done. It's a very, very well developed and very interesting argument that he had already started in the 1921 on dictatorship, which is one of the few, if not the only, exposition on dictatorship that exists up to the present. That's a sign of if anyone is interested that I can talk about. Let me move on. The basic law, the basic law of 1949. So having experienced the unprecedented evil of Nazism, the basic law of Grundgesetz of 1949, the newly established Federal Republic of Germany, embedded in the constitutional text the concept of what is known militant democracy. In other words, those who do not accept the democratic constitutional order are not allowed to compete for political power. And who are those who do not accept the democratic constitutional order? Basically, extremist parties on the right or the left who argue that they want to dismantle it where they can go to power. And that, in a way, would be not only incoherent but also unreasonable to allow these authoritarian parties to compete for political power. Okay, so what is going on in Cuba? Neither Cuba's 1901 nor Cuba's 1940 Constitution allow for one political parties. That was not the case. It did not exist. We do not have that tradition. Germany didn't have it too. They experimented with Weimar, and I think as Carl Schmitt pointed out, the constitutional order in Weimar had a great tension between Article 48, the dictatorship powers that the president had, and Article 76, where it allowed all political parties to compete for political power. When they tried to balance that out under the fascist Nazi threat, the whole thing collapsed. Not only because of the incoherence there, but for other factors. Anyway, neither Cuba's 1901 nor Cuba's 1940 Constitution allow for banning political parties. While Cuba's 1940 Constitution does not allow for the banning of political parties per se, it improved. That was an improvement over the 1901 Constitution by underscoring Article 38, or restricting or prohibiting a citizen's participation in the nation's political life are punishable. So that's kind of a defense against the abuse of power, against government officials and also political parties. Presumably members of political parties, government officials, or other organizations that try to prevent citizens from exercising their political rights within the framework of a multi-party constitutional democracy could be punished as individuals, not as the party as such. Okay. And then we have the already mentioned Article 40, the notion of article of defense. Now, Germany's short experiment with constitutional democracy during the Weimar Republic ended with the tragic sovereign dictatorship of National Socialism, embodying Adolf Hitler's personality as the Führer of the German Reich. Cuba's short experiment with constitutional democracy ended with the overthrow of Cuban constitutional government by Fulgencio Batista, first in 1952, and then the overthrow of Batista's dictatorship in January 1st, 1959, by Fidel Castro of the July Movement. Thereafter, Fidel Castro proclaimed himself as the commander-in-chief of the revolution, Comandante en Jefe, establishing Cuba a Marxist sovereign dictatorship that has lasted with some modifications until the present. And you hear me that I'm underscoring sovereign dictatorship. That's very important to underscore. And you can ask me later if we have time. If the current leadership were to collapse or to allow for substantive democratic changes, Cuban citizens would be faced with the choice of continuing with some form of authoritarian government or opt for a constitutional democracy. Given the unprecedented suffering that the Cuban people have experienced and continue to experience under the Marxist dictatorship of the Communist Party, it seems to me that it's reasonable to assume that the majority of citizens will choose a new Magna Carta based on some form of constitutional democracy. And, in a way, some form of militant democracy. Like the German citizens after the defeat of Nazism in 1945, Cuban citizens will face what is known as the paradox of democracy. A paradox might be conceived as two or more self-belief, each of which is plausible, but if they were held together, they would be inconsistent. In other words, you will be contradicting yourself. Namely, they would not all be true. For example, suppose that one holds to believe that all parties have an equal right to compete for political power, based on the principle of majority. In addition, also one holds the second belief that a political party, if elected, will eliminate all other political parties. If one were to hold both these two beliefs, this inconsistent belief, which I think that we have been expressed before, I think it's as democratic during the Weimar Republic, authoritarian parties who exploit the interstitial inconsistency of those beliefs to try to come up to power and destroy a constitutional democratic order. Cuban citizens are facing these, or will likely face this in the future. I have another part of it, don't me off. Thanks a lot. I'm sorry
podemos, más jugo le podemos sacar a este panel. Así que por favor, preguntas de alguien.
Good afternoon. Apologize for walking in.
Sir, please walk through the microphone.
Apologize for walking in the middle of your speech. A couple of things that I noticed from your speech. You mentioned there were certain actions that you shouldn't take, that were not. And I'm curious if you could expand on that. Also, your thoughts on why taking those actions? More importantly, any special interests that you think are behind reasons why we're not taking that. And then, your speech, you mentioned something that I think was very important, which is, this is not revenge, right? It's process, which I think is very important. How do we ensure that us, who wants to push this, democratization of Cuba, ensure that the oppressed don't become the oppressors? And one of the things that the founding fathers did here, which I think is very important, is due process.
Right.
How do we ensure that we retain that going forward? Because without that moral authority, oppressors are becoming oppressed. I don't think it's going to work.
Valid question. I'll let Jason take it on first.
I want to start with the last part first, but maybe I shouldn't. There's two parts to this great question you've asked us here. And I think a lot of it has to do with, we've studied this a lot. And I think we've heard phenomenal presentations, and I wish we had more time because they're all elaborating on things we need right now more than ever. But we have to reach the phase now of acting and implementing a lot of what we've been talking about since I said, since 1983 at least. I was only 13. But it's seared within me a lot of things about this process that I never thought would take 43 years, much less with the fact that on the first part of your question, there's two parts here. The U.S. has a role to play, I believe. It has invested a lot of America's political capital to the Cuba issue. Yet, in my opinion, this is a political opinion, not a legal opinion, we need to do a better job of enforcing these laws that we've spent America's political capital, that include guardrails for this very conversation we're having. I mean, if you go through Helms-Burton, you can see things that we thought ahead of, Congress thought ahead of. We're not going to validate the communist system. And here are the tools to prevent that. We can talk later about why it hasn't happened, but it's there. So if Cuba wants to engage with this marketplace again, if it wants access to the U.S. market, it's a privilege, it's not a right. Cuba doesn't have a right to come here. No country has a right to come here and tell us how to run our foreign policy, how to run our Treasury Department, how to access our states, how to access our financial system. If Cuba wants to change, it has a roadmap. It's had it for at least 30 years, but we don't enforce the law. That's a political question. That's a lack of, in my opinion, a lack of focus, a lack of political will to do what we already say we were going to do, but we're not doing it. The second part of your question, and I think this is the more important one, which is why I hammer on it a lot. The political future of Cuba is for the Cuban people. I cannot think of a country so blessed as Cuba, frankly. Despite the 70 years of what they've lived through, there's a lot of talent there. A lot of it's here now. We've got to talk to each other. We're not talking to one another. Some people won't even have a regular meeting with somebody because you happen to be with a group of people who you do not agree with because you don't agree on how you're going to change that over there. That's not our job. We have to talk to one another first and show that we can engage in that process. Look what happened in Venezuela. This is the last, I'll conclude with this. Do you think a lot of us are happy with what happened in Venezuela? No. And we're glad Maduro's no longer in the picture. But have we not legitimized that system somehow, albeit indirectly? And that's a complex foreign policy conversation. We have a chance here to do this right. And I think part of it begins, number one, the U.S. needs to enforce the law, and I hope this administration will do it. It hasn't happened yet, 100%. And number two, the Cuban American community diaspora needs to come together a little bit more. Now, there's a lot we can start doing now, because we've done a lot of work. This has been studied so much. There's so much history documented. And I think we just got to start organizing ourselves and preparing for what I think is coming. I don't know when, but I think it's going to happen and we need to be ready for it.
I'll be real quick. I think by
A visa, they won't let me in. I represent Americans who are wrongfully detained in Cuba, right here from this city. This is to answer the third part of your question. I'm going to be a little political right now. It is so difficult to get our policymakers to focus on this. It's a difficult topic. And in Spanish, is an expression somebody told me today, las cosas se pueden ir como sal y agua. And that's politics for you. It shouldn't be that hard though, because we have a roadmap. So we don't advocate for our own people locked up in Cuba. Why is that? I spoke to a man who's been locked up in a Cuban prison for 20 years. Just a month ago. I didn't believe it. I thought it was a Cuban regime distraction to keep me busy. No, there's a man in a Cuban prison, an American citizen, 20 years. Have you ever heard of this guy? No. Have you ever heard of Alina Lopez, an American from here, locked up in Cuba since 2017, fake charges of espionage? Our policymakers need to be talking about this. And these are people like our lawyer friends in Cuba. Dr. Oscar Elias Bisset, for example, who has Project Amelia. Has anybody heard of Project Amelia? Dr. Elias Bisset's Project Amelia? This room has, but most people don't know what that's all about. So why aren't our elected officials here focusing on a man who just won the Presidential Medal of Freedom many years ago, who has a plan? May not be the best plan, but it's at least a plan. Why aren't we talking about these things? One quick thing, then I'll be quiet. Look at the Cuban Constitution of 2019. These people drafted a constitution, Article 4, Article 5. You mentioned this. We are a socialist system. It is irrevocable. We defend the socialist homeland as supreme duty of every Cuban. But this is the part that should gnaw at everybody, to people figure out what we're up against down there. Every citizen has a right to combat through any means, including armed combat, anyone who is not with the political, social, or economic order established by this Constitution. These people are playing for keeps. Okay? We have a roadmap under U.S. law to deal with these people. Ask your members of Congress, all three of them, why aren't we enforcing U.S. law toward Cuba? Why aren't we restricting Communist Party officials that I know are getting into this country, and we let them? I don't understand this. I think that's, I don't want to get political, but I want to tie it in. That's an important part of getting at justice and accountability is hard. And Julio and his team, I'm glad they gave us a chance to talk about it, but we need to talk, and then beyond talking, put this in motion and start helping this process. It's going to take a long time. We got to start somewhere.
Otra pregunta, another question? Well, I'd like to, each panel maybe to wrap up, say a few words. Me gustaría que cada panelista dijera algunas palabras para cerrar en este...
Ya yo resumí por mi parte.
No, solamente creo que el panel apunta hacia la decisión importante que se va a comportar, cómo se va a establecer un nuevo orden democrático con los mecanismos necesarios para que establecer un legado que continúe el proceso en Alemania y también llevar a cabo, planteando el procedimiento va a ser un procedimiento político y flexible, de acuerdo a las circunstancias. Se va a ir trabajando por lo que hay, no de revanchismo, sino de justicia, cómo se va haciendo la justicia dentro de eso, pero esa justicia va a requerir muchos compromisos, decisiones políticas incómodas, como ha requerido en todos los cambios democráticos que han existido, incluyendo Alemania.
Bueno, muchísimas...
¿Funciona?
Sí, sí.
El problema, yo pienso que los cubanos no somos alemanes. Ahí está el problema. O sea, el pantano que tenemos que atravesar, vamos a salir todos medio sucios para llegar a la Constitución. Primero llegar y después mantenerla, porque mantenerla también es mucho más difícil. Yo tengo inversiones en México bastantes, y en México ahora en menos de 6 años pasó de una democracia débil a un autoritarismo completo, con poder judicial tomado, legislativo y ejecutivo. Y no es un partido comunista, es un movimiento por un tipo que quiso, lo mismo que hizo Castro. Y también recordar que Fidel Castro, señor, cuando llegó en el 1 de enero del 59, muchos cubanos, que yo considero decentes, pero estaban a ritmo de conga victoriando. Y así estuvieron en los fusilamientos, así estuvieron en el 61, así estuvieron. O sea, no somos alemanes, hubo alemanes también indecentes, pero lo que tenemos delante es un pantano que atravesarlo, primero que se vaya, y que haya luz y que haya comida. Pero a atravesar ese pantano vamos a salir todos muy, muy sucios.
Yo solamente quiero, voy a repetir algo que Francisco Rodríguez en un evento que tuvimos la semana pasada dijo: Cuba es una nación, Cuba es un estado fallido, pero no una nación fallida. Yo creo que la experiencia cubana, la de la nación cubana fuera del territorio, ha seguido en función, en éxito. Yo sí estoy optimista de lo que los cubanos podemos hacer. De hecho, fuera del territorio nacional, en libertad, ha demostrado ser sumamente exitoso.
Los alemanes nos vieron los nazis, que yo no
Y Karl Marx.
quería necesariamente los alemanes como los grandes que nos pueden sacar de esto.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Gracias a la Universidad Internacional de la Florida, al Instituto de Investigación Cubana. Gracias a ustedes. Que Dios los bendiga. Y gracias a los panelistas.